The wine was still dripping down my face when she laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not the uncomfortable kind people produce when they don't know what else to do. A full, delighted, ugly laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep inside a person where contempt has been stored for a very long time. Thanks, Dad. Maybe that'll teach him some respect. Filthy pig. That was Bridget. My wife's younger sister. And the man sitting across the table from me, the one slowly lowering the crystal wine glass back to the tablecloth like he'd just made a perfectly reasonable point during a board meeting, that was Harlan Voss. My father-in-law. A man who had never once, across 4 years of my marriage to his daughter, looked at me like I was anything more than a problem he hadn't yet figured out how to solve. My wife, Eloise, sat completely still beside me. She didn't reach for my hand. She didn't say his name. She didn't stand up. She looked down at her plate like the moment might pass if she waited long enough. There were 11 other people at that table. New Year's Eve dinner at the Voss family estate in Highland Park, Dallas. White tablecloths, catered food, a house that costs more than most people earn in 20 years. And me, Conrad Ellison, sitting there with a $600 shirt soaked in Chateau Margaux while my wife's family decided whether or not to laugh along. Most of them did. I want to be precise about something before I tell you what happened next. I am not a man who loses his temper in public. I'm a corporate attorney. I have sat across from people at negotiating tables who were actively trying to destroy companies I'd spent years building relationships with, and I have never once raised my voice. I know what it means to stay calm when every cell in your body is telling you to do otherwise. I know exactly what that costs. And I know exactly what it's worth. So when I tell you that I felt my hands grip that chair with everything I had, understand, that wasn't me losing control. That was me deciding very deliberately what control was going to look like that night. I stood up. I set my napkin on the table. I excused myself quietly. And I walked to the hallway and made one phone call. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they were humiliating a man who had everything to lose. What they didn't know was that the phone call I was about to make would begin unraveling something Harlan Voss had spent 15 years carefully building, something that depended entirely on one thing: staying quiet. My name is Conrad Ellison. I'm 46 years old. I was raised in Fort Worth by a single mother who worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood and never once complained about it, not to me, not to anyone. She packed a lunch and a list of goals every morning and treated both with equal seriousness. I put myself through undergrad at UT Austin, law school at SMU in Dallas, and spent the next 2 decades building a boutique practice in corporate and family business law that became, I'll say modestly, one of the more respected firms in North Texas. My clients are multi-generational family businesses navigating exactly the kind of internal politics that make good people do ugly things to each other. I've seen everything. I thought I had. I met Eloise Voss 7 years ago at a charity gala at the Ritz-Carlton in Uptown Dallas. She was wearing a dark green dress and arguing quietly but fiercely with a waiter about whether the event should have hired more local caterers. She had opinions. She stated them clearly and apologized to nobody. I introduced myself. We talked for 3 hours. I was done for. What I didn't fully understand then, and what I should have asked more questions about, was the world she came from. The Voss family is old Dallas money. The kind that doesn't advertise itself but has its name quietly attached to buildings, foundations, and endowments across the city. Harlan Voss built the family's commercial real estate portfolio into something significant over 3 decades. He knows exactly how much everything costs and exactly what leverage every relationship gives him. He sits on 3 nonprofit boards, goes to the right church, plays golf with the right people, and has never in his life been told no by someone he considered beneath him. I was a problem from the first day Eloise brought me home. Not because I was unsuccessful. Not because I was disrespectful. The problem was simpler and uglier. I didn't come from his world, didn't owe anything to his world, and didn't need anything from it. For a man whose entire operating system runs on leverage, a son-in-law he can't leverage is a son-in-law who terrifies him. He covered it with politeness at first, firm handshakes, polite interest in my career, occasional comments about how impressive it was that I'd built something from nothing, delivered in exactly the tone you'd use to compliment a stray dog for learning to sit. Eloise didn't hear it. She'd grown up breathing that air. I heard it every time. Then came Bridget. Eloise's younger sister has never held a job for more than 14 months. She has a degree she rarely mentions, an ex-husband nobody talks about, and a talent for managing the social politics of the boss inner circle that is genuinely impressive in its own terrible way. She knew exactly who sat where in that family long before I arrived, and she made it her project to make sure I understood my position. The comments were always small. Almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. A reference to the neighborhood I'd grown up in, delivered with a small smile. A question about where my mother was these days, asked sweetly, knowing my mother had passed away 3 years earlier. Stories at family dinners about people who'd come up the hard way that always somehow looped back to the importance of knowing where you came from. Harlan never corrected her. He'd smile and change the subject, which was its own kind of permission. Eloise hated it. She told me she hated it. We had versions of the same argument 30 times across 4 years of marriage. She'd confront her father. Things would smooth over for a few weeks. Then it would start again, a little worse each time, the boundary pushed a little further, the reset lasting a little less long. And I kept thinking, because I am at my core an optimist about people, that there was a version of this that could be resolved. That the Voss family wasn't irredeemable. That patience and time would eventually land somewhere good. I was wrong. New Year's Eve in Highland Park is where I finally understood exactly how wrong. The Voss estate on Beverly Drive is a 1920s Tudor revival that Harlan and his wife Sandra had renovated twice and maintained with the kind of precision that tells you a house is more stage set than home. The dining room seats 16 comfortably. That night there were 13 of us, Harlan and Sandra, Eloise, and me, Bridget and her current boyfriend who rarely said anything, Eloise's brother Garrett and his wife Naomi, 2 sets of family friends, and Harlan's mother Dolores, 91 years old, who said very little but watched everything. Eloise had asked me on the drive over to be patient. Harlan had been under stress with a commercial deal in Fort Worth. Let things go. I told her I always let things go. She gave me a look that said she knew exactly what that cost me and loved me for paying it anyway. The first hour was fine. The food was excellent. Garrett and I had a genuinely good conversation about a construction contract dispute he was navigating. Sandra was warm in her distant way. Even Bridget was behaving, which should have been a sign, because Bridget's politeness is never a resting state. It's preparation. The conversation turned, as it always did at Voss family dinners, to business. Harlan's Fort Worth deal. A new mixed-use development near West 7th Street. He was describing the financing structure, the partnership arrangement, the timeline. And then he said something professionally wrong. He described a contractual provision between 2 of his LLCs as legally airtight. I knew, specifically and professionally, that the provision he was describing had been challenged in Texas courts and found unenforceable in 2 separate cases within the past 18 months. The kind of error that could cost him and his partners hundreds of thousands of dollars if the deal went sideways. So I said quietly, and without any drama, that he might want to have someone take another look at that clause. That there had been some recent case law in Texas that complicated it. Harlan set down his fork. Conrad, I've been structuring deals in this city since before you had a law license. I think I understand my own contracts. Of course, I said. I'm just mentioning it as something worth a second look. The Meridian Partners case out of Harris County last spring specifically addressed that provision. I didn't ask for legal advice. No, I said. You didn't. I apologize. I picked up my glass. I thought it was over. It wasn't over. You know, Harlan said, and his voice had changed, the way the air changes before a storm arrives. Eloise's grandfather had a saying. He said you could always tell a man's character by whether he knew when to speak and when to keep his mouth shut. The table went very quiet. Dad, Eloise said, her voice low and careful. I'm just making a point, Harlan said pleasantly. It's a good point, Bridget said, smiling at me across the table with a smile that had teeth in it. I looked at Harlan. I did not look away. I said nothing. I had been a lawyer for 20 years. I knew the value of silence. And that is when he picked up his wine glass, leaned forward, and threw it in my face. Not a fumble. Not an accident. He picked it up, looked at me, and threw it. The wine hit my face and ran down my collar. Cold. The room went absolutely still. And then Bridget laughed, that full, delighted, ugly laugh, and said the words I will never forget for as long as I live. Dolores, Harlan's 91-year-old mother, set her fork down very slowly and looked at her son with an expression I didn't have a name for then. I do now. It was shame. My wife didn't move. I sat there for exactly 3 seconds. Then I stood up, set my napkin on the table, excused myself quietly, and walked to the hallway. The hallway of the Voss estate is long, floored in original oak that creaks in 2 specific spots near the coat closet. I knew this because I'd walked it 40 times across 4 years. I stood at the window overlooking the side garden and I dialed. The man I called is named Preston Ware. Partner at a downtown Dallas firm handling commercial real estate litigation. We'd known each other 16 years, referred clients, consulted on overlapping cases. More relevantly, Preston had come to me 8 months earlier about a contract dispute involving a certain Highland Park commercial developer whose LLC structure had some very interesting characteristics. I had declined at the time due to a conflict of interest. But I'd reviewed enough of the documents to know exactly what was in them. Preston, I said when he picked up, 10:45 on New Year's Eve, is the Voss situation still unresolved? A pause. Conrad, why are you calling me about this on New Year's Eve? Because I just had Chateau Margaux thrown in my face by Harlan Voss in front of 13 people, and I want to know if what I think I know about his partnership structure is something his current partners are aware of. A longer pause. You're serious. Completely. Are you still conflicted out? I thought about Eloise sitting at that table with her eyes on her plate. No, I said. I don't believe I am. Preston was quiet for a moment. Then, call me tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I've got documents you're going to find very interesting. I stood at that window for another minute, looking out at the garden Harlan Voss paid $3,000 a month to maintain. And I made a decision. Not a hot decision, not a revenge fantasy. A cold, clear, professional decision about exactly how I was going to handle what came next. Then I went back to the dining room, sat down beside my wife, finished dinner, made appropriate conversation, shook hands, and said Happy New Year to the other guests. I thanked Sandra for a lovely evening because she'd had nothing to do with what her husband did and she looked like she was going to cry. I said nothing to Harlan. I said nothing to Bridget. On the 12-minute drive home to Lakewood, Eloise cried the entire way. Not quietly, fully, the kind of crying that has been waiting a long time to happen. When we were parked in our own driveway I said, I need you to understand something. I've been patient with your family for 4 years. I've absorbed things I shouldn't have absorbed. I've let things go that I shouldn't have let go, and I've done it because I love you and because I believed the situation could improve. Tonight changed that, not because wine was thrown at me, but because of what it means that it was thrown. And what it means that nobody at that table stopped it. She said she should have said something. Yes, I said. You should have. We sat in the driveway for a long time. What are you going to do? She asked. My job, I said. Here's what Preston's documents showed me when I called him New Year's morning. Over the previous 6 years, Harlan Voss had structured a series of commercial real estate partnerships across the Dallas-Fort Worth area using a network of LLCs that, on the surface, looked like standard development vehicles. His outside partners, people who invested alongside him based on the Voss name and reputation, didn't know that the management fee structure buried in amendment schedules and side letters was redirecting a portion of those fees into a separate entity Harlan controlled alone. His partners had been subsidizing his personal overhead for years without knowing it. In Texas, this kind of arrangement can constitute breach of fiduciary duty. Depending on the specifics, it can rise to something considerably more serious. I came on as co-counsel. Preston and I connected the documents his client had with two former boss partners who had noticed discrepancies in their distributions and never understood why. Those two partners retained their own counsel and joined the action. By the end of January, Harlan Voss was facing a civil lawsuit from 4 former and current business partners, a formal complaint to the Texas Real Estate Commission, and the beginning of what would eventually become a securities fraud investigation, because several of the investment vehicles had been structured in a way that triggered federal oversight. The Fort Worth deal he'd been talking about at the New Year's dinner, the one I'd quietly tried to warn him about, collapsed entirely when his lead financing partner pulled out upon learning about the litigation. That deal alone represented 18 months of development and multiple millions in projected returns. His attorney called me in February wanting to discuss a quiet resolution. I told him the decision about whether to pursue a confidential settlement or a public one belonged entirely to the people who had been harmed, and that those people had no particular reason at the moment to be generous about keeping things private. The civil case settled in March. I can't discuss specific terms. What I can tell you is that Harlan Voss's involvement in active real estate partnerships in the DFW area has changed dramatically. The Voss Family Foundation, which Sandra had chaired for 12 years with genuine pride, had to restructure its funding and scale back several programs. The Highland Park estate is currently listed for sale. Dolores, Harlan's 91-year-old mother, sent me a handwritten letter in February, mailed to my office on Commerce Street. 4 sentences. She said she had watched her son become a man she didn't recognize over the past decade. She said she was sorry for what happened at her family's table. She mentioned a church connection between her family and mine from Fort Worth that I had no idea existed. She said she believed I was a man of character. I kept that letter. It's in my desk in the drawer I don't open every day. Now let me tell you about Eloise, because this story isn't only about Harlan. The weeks after New Year's Eve were the hardest of our marriage. Not because of the wine. Not because of Bridget's laugh. But because of the silence at that dinner table, the silence Eloise and I both understood and neither wanted to say out loud first. She loved her father. Whatever he was and whatever he'd done, she had grown up in that house, eaten at that table, carried that name. Processing the fact that the man she'd watched build something real had been quietly cheating the people around him for years, that was something she had to do on her own terms. We had conversations that February that belong only to the two of us. What I'll tell you is that Eloise is braver than she gives herself credit for. The moment she stopped trying to protect a version of her father that didn't exist was the moment I watched her become more fully herself than I had ever seen her be. She called Harlan in mid-February. I was in the other room. When she came out, her eyes were red but her shoulders were straight. She said he asked if she knew what I was doing. Asked her to make me stop. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him, she said, that the only person who could have stopped this was him, 4 years ago, when he first decided that the man I married wasn't worth basic human decency. And that what he did to his partners was between him and God and the Texas court system. But what he did to me was between him and me. And it's going to take a very long time before I'm willing to have that conversation. I asked if she was okay. She said, ask me again in a year. Bridget called me once in late January. I don't know what she expected. She said, I hope you understand that whatever you're doing is going to destroy this family. I said, Bridget, the actions destroying this family happened long before New Year's Eve. I'm one of several attorneys involved in a civil matter initiated by your father's former business partners. I don't control what happens next. I only control my own professional obligations. She said, you've always thought you were better than us. I said, no. I've always thought I deserved to be treated like a human being at a dinner table. Those two things are not the same. She hung up. Garrett, Eloise's brother, called me last month. He apologized for not saying anything at that table. I told him I appreciated it. He said, "I always knew you were the one person in that room who actually knew what he was doing." I said, "I'm not sure that's a compliment to either of us." He laughed. That felt like something. It's been 8 months since New Year's Eve. Eloise and I had dinner last weekend at a restaurant in Bishop Arts we'd been going to since before we were married. We talked for 3 hours about everything except her family, which is its own kind of progress, because a year ago that silence would have been full of things we weren't saying. Now it's just Tuesday. She's in therapy. She'll tell you that herself. She's doing the work of figuring out what she wants her relationship with her parents to look like going forward. That's hers. I wouldn't try to do it for her. My practice is doing well. It is always doing well because the work is real and the clients are real and the problems I solve are real. None of that depends on whose table I sit at on New Year's Eve. Here's what I want to leave you with. The wine Harlan boss threw at my face was the worst mistake he ever made. Not because it humiliated me, it did, in front of people whose opinions I didn't much care about. Not because it revealed who he was, I already knew who he was. Because it freed me. For 4 years I had been navigating that family with the careful patience of a man protecting someone he loves from the full weight of who her family is. Making choices about preservation, of Eloise's peace, of her relationships, of the fragile fiction that things might improve if I was just a little more patient. The wine freed me from that. Not into anger, anger is not a strategy. Into clarity. Into honesty about what was actually true. And the freedom to handle what was true the way I handle everything, professionally, methodically, and with full knowledge of what the facts actually are. Harlan Voss spent 15 years building a reputation on leverage. He leveraged relationships, his name, the social architecture of Highland Park into something he could use. What he never understood is that leverage only works when the other person doesn't know what they're holding. I knew what I was holding. I just hadn't decided to use it yet. My mother used to say, "Conrad, people will tell you who they are. Your job is to believe them the first time." She told me that when I was 12 years old. I'm still, 34 years later, trying to live up to it. I believed Harlan Voss. I just waited too long to act on what I believed. The humiliation someone hands you is not information about your value. It is information about their fear. Every cutting comment, every dismissal, every performance of superiority, all of it, every bit of it, was a man trying to manage his terror of someone he couldn't control. Harlan Voss threw wine at my face because I was the one person at that table he had no leverage over. And he was right to be afraid.